Welcome to the HR Congress podcast. Today, we'll be speaking with Luuk Sombezki. In this episode, we'll talk about ABN AMRO's playbook towards becoming a more employee-centric organization. Good morning and welcome to the HR Congress podcast today. My name is Ben Churchhouse and today I'm joined by Luuk Sombezki. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
You did?
Okay, awesome.
Good morning.
And Luuk is the EX lead and HR strategy consultant at ABN AMRO. And Luuk is going to be joining us at the Digital HR Innovation Week this May, presenting a session entitled Our Playbook Towards a More Employee-Driven Organization. So thank you for joining me today, Luuk. Very strange times we're living in. It's always a pleasure to speak with someone like yourself.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So I wanted to get started with a couple of basic introductory questions. I'm not going to focus on the whole coronavirus situation because we've kind of already talked about that. And there's plenty of other more authoritative figures to listen to than myself. So before we get into most of the other questions about your sessions and what you're doing at ABN AMRO, can you please tell our listeners a little more about yourself and your current role in the organization?
Sure. So, Luuk Sombezki, I'm 30 years old, born and raised in the Netherlands, and now live together with Desiree and our two daughters, spending all our time at home at this stage. I spent actually all my career in HR. The first decade, I would say, at Accenture, and now already for 5 years with ABN AMRO. And within ABN AMRO, I'm responsible for employee experience, which in our case is a bank-wide strategic initiative we are focusing on. And in general, we cover three topics. So the first is we facilitate our teams to design new services and products using more human-centered design, service design, design thinking approach. We also try to focus on capability development to see how we can improve the skills of all those people so they are not as much depending on us as they are doing right now. And the last one is that we also try to scale it in our organization. So we started small, maybe already the first lesson I would share with the audience. We try to now to scale in the organization. So we work together with, for instance, our IT, digital workplace teams, facility management, but also communications, for instance, and together define the priorities, putting the voice of the employees, of course, center stage.
Can you please provide a little more context on why ABN AMRO decided to put such an effort into becoming more employee-driven? It sounds like a very basic question, but what would be your perspective on how this push towards becoming more employee-centric and employee-driven came about?
So I joined ABN 5 years ago, and back then we were really, I think like most HR organizations before I came from, really focusing on the business agenda and really focusing on solutions and products we were delivering. But we were not necessarily focusing on the problems and needs our employees had. So we were like building these really cool and awesome products, but were then left on the shelf for nobody to use, which was also kind of frustration for the people building them because they had all put all their efforts and energy into it. Back then we had the urgency to also decrease cost by 30%. So then we need to, let's say, redefine what our approach and strategy will be like. And then we started actually with the belief that happy people will lead to happy customers. There are a lot of people already talking about it. And we said, okay, we are focusing much more on the consumers, the employees, and build the products for them rather than only focusing on the business agenda. We probably can do a better job focusing our efforts. Secondly, I think that's probably for most organizations, but certainly for banks nowadays, we are really in a transformation to redefine what the organization looks like. Things like data and digital become much more important to reinvent the customer experience. And to get there, of course, we also need to have different talent. At this stage, we need much more recruiting IT developers and data scientists, for instance, than we were doing like 5-10 years ago. In order to get them to even think about joining ABN AMRO, we need to ensure that we really understand their needs and then tap into their minds and come into their world. And therefore, there's also designing services and products they would like to use, so that they say or feel like, hey, this is ABN AMRO really gets me, they understand me. In order for us to, of course, attract them and retain them.
So, what does being more employee driven look like in practice, and what are some of the goals of this process, from your perspective?
That's a good question. I think certainly the employee experience is the buzzword of 2020, maybe together with agile HR, I would say, maybe for the last year, but also for years to come. And for us, it's actually to take a really human-centered approach. So really putting the employee at center stage. And in most cases, that means for us, we start out with using our data. So we have a very advanced analytics team, which we work closely with. So every month we ask about like 10% of our people, would you recommend ABN AMRO as an employer? And next to asking that, it's like the promoter question, we also ask them, okay, can you think of something that goes quite well? And can you also mention something that we could improve upon? And using that data really gives us the right topics to put our focus on. So you could say that when people mention they are less of a promoter, we'll be interested to see what kind of tips, I would say, that they are giving. And is there a way that if we are able to understand those pains or those problems or those needs, then we can improve their experience and therefore also, in a way, how they promote us as an employer. So once we have that data, we really dive into qualitative research. It's more the human-centered design, really design thinking, service design, those kind of methodologies. And we use things like prototyping, doing experiments. And I think the key here is that we don't do it on our own. I would say we're not doing it as HR or as facilities or IT. We really do it together with our employees. So co-creation, I think, is also one of the key things you need to be thinking of when really focusing on your employees. It's really easy to think you know it all and think you have the right solution. But once you do it together, you will see that you will have completely different insights. So after understanding the problem, we're trying to, let's say, fix the problem right. And then after doing all of these experiments and ideas and prototyping with our employees and see what works and what doesn't, then we will decide if we can scale it up to the whole company. And so we are really never 100% for sure, but in most cases certain that we will be successful in launching these products and services.
From your perspective, how has the practical thinking about employee experience changed over the last, 5 or 10 years? Because we know that it's a very popular term at the moment. I've always been a little conceptually confused about what employee experience actually entails on like a really practical level for a lot of organizations. So how have you seen the term develop in its practical application?
It's a good question. I mean, we 4 years ago, we just started off with the belief that if we focus on our employees, that will lead to more happy customers in the end. And we just started experimenting, learning what works, what doesn't work. And it's like a kind of an evolution in which we experience that first you're unaware of what you don't know, and then you become aware of what you don't know, and then we're building it gradually. It's like an iterative approach. And for me, what has changed over the years, I think in the beginning, I think putting humans at the center has already been something like 50 years ago already. Through the ages, HR, but also a lot of corporates moved into a much more business-driven approach, where we leaned a lot on our specialists to say, okay, you're the expert in this field, so you probably know what you need to do. And all forgot about the end user in this case. And now we are really shifting that towards that. We're saying, okay, it's more about just focusing on the end user at first and letting go of all your biases, all the things you think you know and you think that our customers and employees would need, and put that aside. And then once you understand the problem, then use that expertise to really ensure that what we are building really fits their need. So long story short, I would say, I think the evolution is more that, personally think a human-centered design is here to stay. probably don't call it employee experience anymore in like 5 years. You can see that there are a lot of people who are doing employee experience and a lot of people who are talking employee experience. I don't believe there's a one size fits all. Jacob Morgan, I think, puts it maybe best when he says it's all interactions that an employee has with regard to his work, both physically, digitally, and emotionally. I'm not sure if that are three stages, more or less in that sense. And we now call it employee experience, and maybe in 10 years we just call it work again. So I'm not really caught up on the title. It's more like a buzzword that we need to use in order that other people understand what we are doing.
It strikes me a little bit more like a general principle, right? It's sort of the same way that agile has been maligned or reinterpreted in many ways. At the core principle of agile, it's a set of principles, right? It's a guiding set rather than a strict methodology. And I think employee experience, perhaps over the last few years, has been sort of caught up a little bit in that same frame of mind. It's more of a holistic principle guideline set about how to interact and how to work, rather than this is a strict play-by-play methodology that you have to follow. You have to have the pool table after work drinks, and you have to have this technology, and you have to have this process. Well, no, you don't. You have to have a human-centric focus, and there are a lot of different ways to do that. So I think that leads on to another question I'd like to ask is what are some of the key do's and don'ts that you have encountered over the last couple of years? Maybe if you're giving advice to other organizations or people in a similar position.
So first, go back to your comment. I think I totally agree. It's not really rocket science. I mean, it's a basic. Just focus on your employees, on the human, and see what their needs are, rather than over-engineering it. I think a lot of consultants try to do that as well because they try to sell those kind of things and try to copy what other people are doing. That's why it's also so easy to share our approach with any audience because it doesn't really necessarily give them any competitive advantage because it wouldn't work that if you would copy everything that we are doing for our employees, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will be successful for your employees. Yeah, you have to understand what is in their mind and their need and design your products on that. So going back to your question, I would say the key do for me would just be just do it. So I think often, and I used to be one of them, so I have like 13 years expertise in compensation and benefits, a really solid specialty of mine. What specialists try to do often is that they try to get the whole picture, make things perfect. But what we came to understand, and I think Agile helped in that as well, is that perfect is actually the enemy of good. And nowadays, because we're now experiencing this even more and more, I think that even good is even too high of a level that we are settling for. Because what we now experience is when we design new services and products, it's actually not about making the things perfect, but it's about having the right conversation with our employees to see what's in their minds and in their needs, rather than making sure that it's all shiny and it's all online and digital, etc. It should really fit the purpose. And just start doing it and starting off with shitty first drafts, as they call it, that really helps with that. Don't be too scared to make any mistakes because that's actually the best way to learn. And when you overthink and over-engineer it, you're often already too much in love with your solution and forget about why you started off in the first place.
I totally understand. Just get out there and do it and don't be afraid of failing. I think that's a very important part because, we can often be perfectionists and really try too much. As long as you're on the right track, especially regarding putting people at the center of work, then yeah, you can experiment a bit and find out what works, what doesn't. As long as you're learning and you're on generally the right path, you're probably going to be okay. What is one thing that you would like to have known about this area of employee experience, maybe before you started working specifically in EX? I know this is kind of a hypothetical question. We're just having a bit of fun, but what would you like to have told yourself 15 years ago? Perhaps advice for yourself or advice for others?
Ooh, so good question. I think the main habit I would say you need to have is curiosity. So be curious, be open, and also be vulnerable, that will take you a long way. So if you just ask, okay, why is that like this? So why is it like that? How does this work? Or why are you saying that? So why do you feel like that? It gives you so much information rather than just jumping into conclusions and jumping into things you probably are already thinking of because of this capability, and especially you have on a certain expertise, I would say. The openness is so important. Really have the empathy with your employees. Yeah.
Awesome. So your presentation is going to be taking place on the 20th of May at 4:15 p.m. Can you please tell our listeners a little more about what they can expect from that session, some of the key points that you're going to be addressing there?
Yeah. So in general, and I hope, of course, a lot of people will join. I'll be sharing our journey. So this is a journey we already embarked upon like 3 years ago. So I also want to be, let's say, upfront with all those people thinking about embarking on a similar journey. You really need to have this stamina. It really takes time to really evolve this. This is not a, let's say, old school waterfall project you can do in 9 months and then you are EX. You probably never are fully. So I'll be sharing our journey, the approach we are taking when we are designing new products and services, and of course I want to also share some of the results that we have built so far as maybe kind of an inspiration, and we'll be sharing also some lessons learned. So hopefully others can learn from that, maybe avoid the same mistakes we have made along this journey.
So if any one of our listeners wants to reach out and contact you, how can they do so?
At this stage, we need to keep the physical distance. So don't come by to our home. But the best way is to get in touch with me through LinkedIn. I'm fairly active on it, and if people have some questions, then they can find me there.
Awesome. So thank you very much for joining me today, Luuk. It was a pleasure to speak with you, and I look forward to hearing your presentation more in about a month's time.
Thanks, Ben, and sorry I couldn't avoid making one Corona comment in the end.
It's okay. We'll leave that for another time.